Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for July 20th, 2022. If it seems as though I'm in unfamiliar background circumstances, I am. I'm on the road, but I wanted to join you today because it's absolutely crucial that we stay on top of this situation where we're seeing the world in turmoil. The strategic situation is a mess. We're seeing governments topple, governments taking crazy policies. Inflation is continuing upward. Bloomberg yesterday issued a report on nations that are about to default. 25 nations are on the verge of default, led by El Salvador. Among the list include Pakistan, Argentina, Ukraine, and many African countries. You know which country's not on the list? Russia. Russia, in fact, has a record current account balance. We also have a report from Germany that the largest utility company, Uniper, it needs a bailout from the government if it's going to survive. Now, the European Union is going to be drafting an emergency plan today for dealing with energy. If voluntary measures don't work, in other words, if nations cannot cut their energy use sufficiently to deal with the shortages, the European Union will intervene over the head of member states and impose policies which member states will have no recourse to protest, will have to implement. Now, in this context, we see the absolutely insane policy of the Greens in Germany, with Habeck, the economics minister, coming up with a plan to make electric cars more affordable. Now, as you know, there's an attempt to phase out the internal combustion engine automobile, which has been the driver of the German economy for the last decades, and replace it with hugely expensive electric cars. So what's the solution? Put a higher tax on traditional automobiles so that people will be forced to buy electric cars. Now, there's a response to this globally. Putin, for example, was in Iran the last few days, signed major agreements, including a $40 billion oil exploration deal with the Iran National Oil Company, and also is in discussions for establishing a new trade mechanism for oil that goes outside of the control of the speculators in the spot markets. And he's also talking about doing the same thing with wheat distribution that will be outside of the control of the speculators at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. What this means is that there's a move away from the existing system, which doesn't work for anyone but speculators. Now, Putin is saying that the problem in the West is not Russia, but the crazy policies of the Western governments. And we're seeing more reaction to that. The Dutch farmers issued a call for a worldwide demonstration on Saturday, this coming Saturday, against the anti-science policies of the Green New Deal. We also have the new president of Sri Lanka, who was just elected by the parliament, who attacked the sanctions against Russia, saying that sanctions won't bring Russia to its knees, but it will bring the rest of the world to their knees. Now, this is the context for a new statement issued by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in which she said, "We must end all sanctions now. The sanction policy is doing nothing to defeat Russia, but is destroying the rest of the world economy, along with the green policy and neoliberal economic policies." Now, she started by saying that the president of Serbia, Vučić, is right, that the Ukraine conflict is not a regional war or a local war, but the West is waging a world war against Russia. She pointed out that you have people such as the defense secretary for Raytheon in the United States, Lloyd Austin, saying that the goal is to weaken Russia. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, who's also a green ideologue, said the goal is to ruin Russia. Now, this is geopolitics. This is policies based on behalf of an empire of financial and corporate cartels, which are committed to a policy of destroying the physical economy of most nations and protecting the speculative values that have been built up artificially by gambling and bets over the last years. Now, who benefits from this? Well, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche pointed to is, number one, NATO and the military-industrial complex. The defense spending is skyrocketing. This is the whole point, or one of the points of the war. It's to weaken Russia, but also to provide new profits for Western companies. Who else benefits? The speculators of the City of London and Wall Street, who are driving food and energy prices up and making huge profits from doing so. Also benefiting are the green Malthusians, who are committed to a population reduction on a global scale and are using the artificial creation of shortages to increase the numbers of people who are going to die of starvation, die of unnecessarily from diseases, and so on. This is the plan of Prince Charles and the British royal family. It's the plan of people such as the World Economic Forum's Klaus Schwab, who said that the reason we have a climate crisis is because people want better living standards. So this is who is pushing these policies. And then finally, the political establishment benefits. They're unwilling to acknowledge that their policies have driven the world to the brink. They've caused the breakdown. And what do? They blame Putin. So Mrs. LaRouche's solution is simple. End all sanctions. The sanctions policy is part of what is designed to benefit the people she just identified at the expense of sovereign nation states. Instead, we need cooperation for economic development between sovereign nation states. And Lyndon LaRouche has outlined a whole series of programs in which nations can work together to build up the necessary infrastructure, the advances in science and technology that will increase productivity, including in agriculture. There's no food shortage other than what's artificially created. Farmers in the United States, for example, have proven that if given the credit and given the technology, they will be able to feed the world. Other countries are doing the same. India is doing that. China is increasing it. Russia has a huge increase in wheat production. So we could double world food production overnight. And this is the solution. You're worried about water shortages, desalination from nuclear power. There are any number of technologies that will move us into an era where we don't face the shortages and scarcity. The scarcity and shortages are artificially created to allow for a continuation of geopolitical confrontation as opposed to cooperation. Now, an example of this is the deepening panic of the establishment, which was exemplified by a speech Tony Blair gave at the Ditchley Foundation on July 16th. Ditchley is one of the leading financial think tanks. And what he said is he admitted the West is in a mess. There's stagnating living standards, wages are falling, politics are in turmoil, hyperpolarization, and so on. Now, he said Russia is a big cause of the problem because Russia is behaving like, quote, terrorists, unquote. But he said the real danger is China, which is emerging. And China is not just emerging, it's already here as a danger. And Blair correctly said, we're coming to the end of Western political and economic dominance. What's his solution? We need more money for defense. In other words, more war. And secondly, increased emphasis on soft power, so-called hybrid warfare. In other words, controlling the narrative, manipulation, brainwashing. That's Blair's solution, lying and censorship. And finally, he said, we need to support Biden's policy, which is also the European Union's policy, to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, which is called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is an absurd policy. It's basically putting solar plants on the African continent and denying them the necessary efficient electrical production which is needed for those nations to escape poverty. So you have a very clear alternative now. What Putin is doing to organize alternatives to the existing SWIFT system and existing speculative markets, what Mrs. LaRouche is calling for, to put an end to sanctions and instead move to cooperation. for a new security and financial architecture. And then you have on the other side Blair, more 1984 style war, brainwashing, and chaos. Now, in this context, there's also more discussion of a push for Ukraine to take back Crimea, which would probably lead to an extreme escalation of the situation there. And there's also a series of politicians in the West going to Taiwan, threatening China and insisting that the West must defend Taiwan. So there you have it. It's war and chaos versus cooperation and a new financial and security architecture. Join our mobilization. This is the way we're going to win this fight. Go to the Schiller Institute website, the LaRouche Organization website, study these proposals, circulate them, circulate our videos, and get people to join with us as we move to put an end to this world order of the globalists, of the corporate cartels, of the fascists who insist on depopulating the planet. Thanks for joining me. I'm happy to be back with you, and I'll see you again tomorrow.